The unexpected encounter. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an oppressive golden light over the barren stretch of highway. The heat radiated from the cracked asphalt like a living thing, warping the horizon and making the landscape shimmer. Kevin Matthews, a middle-aged black man with hands worn from years of mechanic work, trudged alongside his battered old car. It had sputtered to a stop miles away from the nearest town, and now, here he was, just a man wandering through the desolate American desert. The air was dry, thick with dust, and every step felt like walking through a furnace. Kevin wasn't in any hurry, just moving at his own pace, but the relentless desert sun made it hard to focus on much else. His car had seen better days, he'd always been more of a mechanic than a driver, and it had finally caught up to him. He wasn't worried, though. He knew cars like the back of his hand, and he could fix most problems with little more than a wrench and a little elbow grease. But now, with no other vehicles in sight and no phone signal, he was left with nothing but the oppressive solitude of the desert. Kevin wasn't particularly fond of the isolation, but he had learned to accept it. He had been alone for a long time now. His mind wandered back to years ago, to times when the desert had been less empty, when he had a family and a life that wasn't defined by miles of nothingness. But the years had passed, and things had changed. He had no illusions about where his life was headed now, just a road ahead that he wasn't sure he'd ever find his way off. But in the midst of this stifling solitude, something caught his eye. Far up ahead, a white sedan was parked on the shoulder of the road. Its hood was raised, and a figure, a woman, was bent over the engine, her back to him. She seemed to be working on something, her movements slow and deliberate. Kevin's instincts kicked in at once. He wasn't about to leave someone stranded out here in the heat of the day, especially in the desolate stretch of highway near the border. The world had a way of being unforgiving in places like this. As Kevin walked closer, he took note of her appearance. She was tall, slender, with long, auburn hair that shimmered in the harsh sunlight. Her clothes were simple, jeans and a t-shirt, but there was something about her that made her stand out. Her posture was stiff, as though she were frustrated or uncertain, which only deepened Kevin's sense of wanting to help. He knew that feeling, of struggling with something beyond your control. It wasn't often that Kevin encountered someone who seemed genuinely in need of help, especially out here. As he approached, he called out in his usual low, friendly voice. "Hey there, looks like you're having some trouble." The woman turned quickly at the sound of his voice, startled for a brief moment, but her expression softened when she saw him. "Oh, thank goodness," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I've been stuck out here for hours. I have no idea what's wrong with the car." Kevin smiled and nodded, stepping forward to offer his assistance. "I'm Kevin," he said, introducing himself. "I'm pretty good with cars. Let me take a look." She hesitated for a moment but then offered her hand, shaking his firmly. "Valerie," she said, her voice slightly strained but grateful. "I've been trying to figure out what's going on, but I think I'm in over my head." Kevin could tell she was exhausted, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The heat was unforgiving, and he could see the faint sheen of sweat on her brow, a sign that she'd been battling with the car for longer than she cared to admit. "Let me have a look," Kevin said, crouching down to examine the engine. Valerie stepped aside, her gaze lingering on him as he worked. Kevin's hands moved quickly, checking the oil, the wires, and the belts. It didn't take him long to identify the issue, a broken spark plug that had caused the engine to stall. He knew exactly how to fix it, but he'd need to find a replacement part, and that would mean getting to the nearest town. As Kevin started to explain the problem to Valerie, the sound of a car approaching cut him off. At first, he thought it was just another traveler passing by, but the vehicle slowed and pulled over, the dust trailing behind it as it came to a stop just behind Valerie's sedan. The patrol car's siren wasn't on, but the presence of law enforcement was enough to make both Kevin and Valerie pause. The officer who stepped out of the car was tall and burly, with a stern face that immediately struck Kevin as unpleasant. He wore a dark blue uniform, his badge gleaming in the harsh sunlight. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, moving over Valerie before coming to rest on Kevin. Kevin had learned over the years to read people, and the officer's gaze immediately made him feel like he was being sized up, like an animal in the zoo. "Everything okay here?" the officer asked, his voice deep and full of authority. His eyes remained fixed on Kevin, though, as if trying to find a reason to be suspicious. Valerie looked up, her expression nervous but reassured by Kevin's presence. "Yes, officer," she said quickly. "This man was just helping me. My car broke down, and he offered to take a look." The officer's eyes narrowed slightly, and his gaze shifted back to Kevin. "Helping you, huh?" he asked, his tone skeptical. "And you are?" "I'm just a guy passing through," Kevin answered, trying to keep his voice calm. He had dealt with suspicion before, but something about the officer's attitude rubbed him the wrong way. The officer didn't seem convinced. He took a few slow steps forward, keeping his eyes on Kevin, almost like he was waiting for something to give him a reason to act. "I don't like the look of this," he muttered, his hand resting lightly on his gun belt. "You a mechanic? You seem a little out of place out here." Kevin's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his voice steady. "I've worked on cars my whole life. You can check my ID if you need to." The officer didn't miss a beat. "I might just do that." "You've got some explaining to do," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. Valerie, clearly uncomfortable with the tension, stepped forward, trying to smooth things over. "Officer, really, there's no need for this. He's just helping me. Please." The officer ignored her and turned to Kevin. "I'll be the judge of that," he said. "Hand over your ID. You don't just walk up to people and offer help without a reason." Kevin could feel his jaw tightening, but he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. He handed the officer his driver's license, and the officer took it with a swift motion, inspecting it as if searching for any discrepancy. The heat of the desert seemed to press in around them, making the situation feel even more suffocating. Kevin couldn't understand what was behind the officer's hostility, he was just trying to help. But the officer wasn't finished. "Kevin Matthews," the officer muttered as he scanned the license. "You sure that's who you are? You don't look like the average guy passing through the desert. You know, we get a lot of people out here with questionable backgrounds." Kevin stood his ground, refusing to let the officer's insinuations rattle him. "I'm just a man helping a woman with a broken car, officer," he said, trying to remain composed. The officer seemed to be weighing something in his mind before turning his gaze back to Valerie's car. "What's in the trunk?" he asked, his voice hard. Kevin glanced at the trunk, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the tarp slightly moved, revealing a glimpse of what lay underneath. He hadn't noticed it before, but now that the officer pointed it out, the items in the trunk seemed oddly out of place, too neatly arranged, too professionally packed. Valerie hesitated, her face pale. I don't know. I didn't put those things there," she stammered, her voice shaking. Kevin's mind raced. Something didn't add up, but he couldn't place it yet. Whatever was going on here, it was clear that Valerie had found herself in something deeper than a simple breakdown. The officer, meanwhile, was already moving toward the trunk, and Kevin's gut instinct told him that this moment would change everything. The officer's hand hovered near his radio, and Kevin knew they were on the verge of something big, something that neither he nor Valerie could have ever anticipated. As the officer reached for the trunk, Kevin's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what was inside, but one thing was for sure, this desert road would never be the same again. The hidden truth. The officer's hand hovered near the trunk, his eyes flicking between Valerie and Kevin. The tension in the air was thick, almost palpable. For a moment, Kevin thought he could hear his heart pounding louder than anything else, a drumbeat that seemed to echo in the suffocating silence of the desert. The officer didn't look at either of them, his gaze remained fixed on the trunk, his posture rigid as if he had already decided what he would find. His hand was inching toward the latch, but Kevin's mind raced, calculating what to do next. "I'm telling you, officer, I don't know what's in there," Valerie said, her voice shaky but desperate. She stepped forward, her face flushed with anxiety. "I didn't put that stuff in the trunk. Please, you have to believe me." The officer's stern expression didn't soften. "If that's true, then why are you so nervous?" His voice dropped, thick with suspicion. "And why didn't you tell me about the contents of the trunk before? Why are you hiding this from me?" Kevin felt a surge of frustration but kept his voice steady. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath. "You're accusing her of something she didn't even know about? How is that fair?" The officer's eyes snapped toward him, an instant change in demeanor. "You think I'm wrong to question her," he said, his tone darkening. "You think I'm out of line for doing my job?" Kevin clenched his fists. His patience was running thin, but he refused to let the situation escalate. "I don't care what you think about me," he replied, his voice cool but firm. "But this woman doesn't deserve to be treated like a criminal just because you're having a bad day." Before the officer could respond, he yanked open the trunk, and Kevin's gaze locked onto the contents. His stomach churned as the sight of the items unfolded in front of him, packages wrapped in thick plastic, and tools that didn't belong in a car's trunk. Among the odd assortment, there were large, black bags that looked too professional, too deliberate. They weren't the kind of things you would expect from a traveler. The unsettling feeling that had been brewing in Kevin's chest now solidified into something darker, more urgent. The officer's eyes widened as he carefully extracted one of the bags, ripping through the plastic with a knife. The contents inside were immediately visible, bundles of cash, stacks of hundreds neatly bundled together. The officer cursed under his breath and reached for another bag. This time, the contents were even more alarming, several black market weapons, neatly packaged and clearly expensive. Valerie stepped back, her face pale as a ghost, her hands shaking. She looked at Kevin with a mix of confusion and fear, unable to comprehend what was unfolding. Kevin's gut instinct told him there was far more to this than just a simple breakdown. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like they had walked into a trap that neither of them could escape. "Why didn't you tell me about this?" the officer demanded, now clearly agitated. "Who the hell do you think you are, rolling up into my jurisdiction with this kind of contraband? I swear I don't know anything about this." Valerie pleaded, her voice cracking. "I didn't even know what was in the trunk. I'm just a tourist, for God's sake. I don't know who put that stuff in there." Kevin stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. Valerie didn't look like a criminal, she didn't even look like someone who had been involved in anything shady. But the evidence was undeniable, and the officer was now seeing it for himself. The wheels in Kevin's head were turning, but no solution was presenting itself. He couldn't ignore what was right in front of him, but he also couldn't let Valerie take the fall for something she clearly didn't understand. The officer was still rifling through the bags, his frustration growing with every item he pulled out. "This is some serious stuff," he muttered to himself. "This is a whole operation right here. And it's all tied up in your trunk, lady. You think I'm going to let this go?" Valerie was trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. She grabbed Kevin's arm, pleading. "Please, you have to believe me. I don't know how this happened. I've been trying to get home to my family. I just wanted to get away from all this chaos, but now this?" Her voice cracked, and Kevin could see the panic in her eyes. She wasn't lying, there was no doubt in his mind. She was just as much a victim of this as he was. Kevin's eyes darted between the officer, Valerie, and the contents of the trunk. Something wasn't adding up. The way the items were packed, the weapons, the money, the way everything seemed too perfect, felt staged, like they were meant to be found. Was this a setup? Was Valerie the target of something much bigger than she realized? And what did that mean for him? The officer slammed the trunk shut, his face twisted in disbelief. "You're coming with me," he said to Valerie, his voice low and threatening. "I don't care what you say. You're under arrest." Valerie recoiled, shaking her head vigorously. "No. I didn't do anything wrong." Kevin stepped forward, positioning himself between Valerie and the officer. "Hold on," he said, his voice tight. "Before you arrest her, you need to listen. Something's not right here." The officer looked at Kevin as if he were an insect. "And what exactly do you think you know, mechanic?" The officer's voice dripped with disdain. "I don't know much, but I know something's off," Kevin said, his tone unwavering. "You said this is some kind of operation, but where's the evidence? All you've got are a few bags, some cash, and some guns. Doesn't seem like enough to just throw her in jail." The officer's eyes narrowed. "Are you questioning my authority?" "No, I'm questioning your judgment," Kevin shot back. "You're jumping to conclusions, and you've got a woman here who's clearly scared out of her mind. You're not even thinking this through." The officer stared at him for a long moment, and Kevin could almost see the gears turning in his head. For a second, it seemed like the officer might back off. But then the harsh reality of the situation hit Kevin. There was no way out. The officer wasn't about to let them off the hook, especially not when he had what appeared to be solid evidence in front of him. "You think you can tell me how to do my job?" the officer growled. Before Kevin could respond, a faint noise interrupted them, a sound that made both of their heads snap toward the desert horizon. Kevin squinted against the sunlight, trying to make out the source. A low rumble, the sound of an engine growing louder. It wasn't just any engine, though. It was the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles approaching, and they were moving fast. The officer turned, his hand immediately going to his radio. "This is Officer Cooper," he spoke into the mic, his voice tense. "I've got 2 individuals here in possession of illegal items. Need backup, ASAP." Kevin's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop anymore. There was something much bigger happening, and the presence of backup meant that things were about to escalate even further. Kevin's mind raced, trying to figure out what had just happened. Who were these people coming to help the officer? And what did it mean for Valerie and him? The sound of engines grew louder, and as the first vehicle appeared over the horizon, Kevin's pulse quickened. The situation had just gotten more dangerous, and it was clear that their lives were about to take a sharp turn into something far more dangerous than they could have ever anticipated. The officer, still clutching his radio, looked at Kevin with newfound caution. "You'd better stay out of this," he muttered, his eyes flicking to the approaching vehicles. Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was about to happen would change everything. But for better or for worse, he wasn't going to walk away now. Whatever this mess was, he was in it now, and there was no turning back. The web tightens. The roar of engines filled the air as the approaching vehicles grew louder, kicking up clouds of dust as they sped down the road. Kevin's gut twisted as he scanned the horizon, trying to make sense of what was happening. The officer, Cooper, hadn't moved an inch, his eyes darting between the approaching cars and Kevin, clearly unsettled. The situation had taken an unexpected turn, and Kevin's instincts told him that things were about to get a lot more dangerous. The vehicles came into view, 2 large black SUVs with tinted windows, their tires kicking up debris as they barreled down the desert road. They were fast, too fast for normal civilians, and the way they moved with precision suggested that whoever was in those vehicles knew exactly what they were doing. As they pulled up to the side of the road, they came to a smooth stop, and 2 men dressed in dark suits stepped out, their presence as commanding as the vehicles they had arrived in. Kevin's breath caught in his throat. These men didn't look like regular law enforcement. They didn't look like any kind of authority he recognized. They were too polished, too controlled, like they had been trained for something much darker. The officer, Cooper, stood up straighter as one of the men approached. His stance was more guarded now, more cautious than before. "We're taking it from here," the man said flatly, his voice low but unmistakable. Cooper hesitated, his hand still clutching his radio. "This is my scene," he growled, a defensive edge to his voice. But the man didn't flinch. "We've got this," the man said with finality, the words sharp and clear. He didn't wait for Cooper's response. Instead, he reached into the SUV and pulled out a small briefcase, a gleam of something dangerous in his eyes. The other man walked over to the trunk of Valerie's car, and Kevin couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened next, it wasn't going to be good. "Who the hell are you?" Kevin asked, his voice hard, but he felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just some routine traffic stop anymore. There was something much bigger at play, something that he and Valerie had been unknowingly pulled into. The man didn't respond right away. He stood there, staring at Kevin for a long moment, sizing him up like a predator with a target. The other man joined him, and together, they began to inspect the trunk, opening the bags with swift precision. Kevin couldn't help but feel a pit form in his stomach. Valerie, still trembling, took a step toward Kevin. "What's going on? Who are they? What do they want with me?" Her voice was almost a whisper, but Kevin could hear the desperation in her words. "I don't know," Kevin replied, his voice low but steady. "But I'm going to make sure they don't hurt you." The man with the briefcase closed it and turned to the other, who was still inspecting the trunk. They exchanged a look. One that didn't sit right with Kevin, like two people involved in a well-practiced game. The first man turned his attention to Valerie. "This woman is involved in something much bigger than a simple breakdown, don't you think?" His tone was calm, methodical, but there was an undercurrent of danger. Valerie stepped back, her hands clutching at her chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice shaking. "I was just trying to get home. Please, I don't know who put that stuff in my car. I didn't even know what was in the trunk." Kevin's mind raced. What did they mean by something bigger? Whatever Valerie was involved in, she was in over her head. Kevin had no idea how this had happened or why it had happened, but one thing was for certain, he couldn't just stand by and watch her get dragged into something dark. The man with the briefcase nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "I believe you," he said finally. "But it doesn't matter whether you knew about it or not. You're in the middle of a situation now that's well beyond your control." The words hit Valerie like a slap to the face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice strained. "What do you want from me?" The man's expression didn't change. "We need to take you with us. There are questions we need answers to, and we don't have time to waste." He stepped closer, his movements deliberate. Kevin could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. This wasn't just an arrest, it was something more. Something more sinister. "No," Kevin said, stepping forward. "You're not taking her anywhere." His words were sharp, and he planted himself firmly between Valerie and the men, his hands clenched into fists. The man glanced at him for a moment, unfazed. Then he raised his hand slightly, signaling the other man. Before Kevin could react, the other man moved with the speed of a predator, stepping around him and grabbing Valerie by the arm. "No!" Valerie screamed, struggling in his grip, but the man's hold was like iron. She looked at Kevin, her eyes wide with fear. "Please. Help me." Kevin's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know who these people were, but they weren't about to get away with this. "Let her go," he shouted, his voice filled with determination. But the man didn't flinch. He simply looked at Kevin, his expression unchanged. "You're making a mistake. This isn't something you can stop." Kevin's mind was racing. He couldn't let them take Valerie, but he was out of his element here. These men were well trained, and there was something about the way they moved that made him realize they weren't just here to take a couple of suspects into custody, they were here for something much bigger, something that involved far more danger than Kevin had anticipated. The man with the briefcase stepped forward again, his eyes now locked on Kevin. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he said, his voice cool, almost condescending. "This situation is far more complex than you realize. If you're smart, you'll walk away now before things get messy." Kevin stood tall, his heart racing, but he wasn't backing down. He wasn't about to let Valerie face whatever these men had planned for her. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't about a breakdown anymore, this was about something much larger. The money, the weapons, the way these men operated. It all pointed to something dark, something criminal. Kevin took a step forward, not entirely sure what he was going to do next but determined to stop them. "I don't care what you say. She's not going anywhere with you." The man with the briefcase's lips curled into a small, humorless smile. "You're making a mistake," he repeated. But his voice was tinged with something darker now. "If you won't cooperate, we'll make you." Before Kevin could react, the man with the briefcase stepped back, his eyes flashing with cold authority. Then, with a signal, the other man, still holding Valerie tightly, pulled her toward one of the SUVs. Kevin's breath hitched. He couldn't let them take her. He had to do something. But as the man with the briefcase nodded at the others, he knew they weren't playing by the same rules. They weren't law enforcement. They weren't even a part of any system Kevin understood. These men were working on a different level, a different agenda. And that was exactly what scared him. "Let her go," Kevin said, his voice low but fierce, his fists clenched. But it was too late. The man with the briefcase turned to the driver of the SUV and gave a single, sharp nod. And just like that, the engines roared to life once more. Racing against the clock. The desert sun seemed to burn hotter, more oppressive now that the men had made their move. Kevin's stomach churned as the SUVs roared to life, their engines cutting through the air with a growl that sent a shiver down his spine. The vehicles weren't just leaving, they were taking Valerie with them. He stood frozen for a moment, his feet rooted to the dirt, watching as they sped away into the vast, unforgiving landscape. Every instinct in Kevin told him to stay put, to let the law handle this, but his gut was telling him something entirely different. Valerie wasn't just a victim of a simple crime. She had been drawn into something far deeper, something far more dangerous, and he couldn't just walk away from that. The officer, Cooper, had seemed confused, almost out of his depth. The arrival of the men in suits, the way they had quickly taken control of the situation, proved that the whole scene was part of something much bigger than either of them realized. Kevin's eyes darted around, searching for something, anything, that could help him understand the situation better. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fractured information that had been thrown at him over the past few hours. The weapons, the money, the man with the briefcase. It all pointed to something illegal, something dangerous. But what was it? Why had Valerie been caught up in this? And why had the officer, Cooper, seemed so powerless to stop it? In a moment of clarity, Kevin knew he couldn't let Valerie disappear without a trace. If she was truly as innocent as she claimed, then she didn't deserve to be dragged into whatever shadowy world these men operated in. The fact that they had taken her so easily meant they knew exactly what they were doing, and Kevin wasn't sure whether he could trust the authorities to do anything about it. Without thinking twice, he pushed forward, his feet pounding the dirt as he started running after the vehicles. His heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline surging through him, but a small voice in the back of his mind tried to tell him it was too late. The SUVs had already gained speed, and the desert stretched on endlessly. The road they were on led to nowhere, and every mile of the barren landscape seemed to swallow him whole. But Kevin couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. His breath came in ragged bursts, the heat of the desert air stinging his throat, but he pushed on. Valerie's face flashed in his mind, her pleading eyes, her trembling hands. She had trusted him. She had believed that he could help her. And now she was being taken by men who had the power to make her disappear without a trace. He couldn't let that happen. Kevin's mind flashed to his days as a mechanic. He was good with his hands, quick with tools, used to solving problems that seemed insurmountable. But this? This wasn't a simple fix. This wasn't a car engine that needed a little tinkering. No, this was something far bigger, something far more complex, and Kevin was caught in the middle of it. Still running, he glanced back at the now vanished officer, Cooper, standing uselessly on the side of the road. Kevin had seen that helplessness in his eyes, the same helplessness he had felt when he had first been confronted by the mysterious men. Cooper had no power here. But Kevin wasn't going to wait around for someone else to fix this. He wasn't going to let Valerie disappear without a fight. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Kevin stopped and looked ahead. The SUVs were still visible in the distance, but they were already miles ahead of him. He couldn't catch them by foot. It was clear now that he had to think smarter, not harder. Kevin's eyes scanned the desert landscape, and that's when he saw it, a dilapidated dirt road leading off the main highway. It looked old, abandoned even, but it ran parallel to the highway. Maybe it could take him to where the SUVs were headed. Maybe it could lead him straight to Valerie. His gut told him that this was his best shot. There was no time to waste. He turned and ran toward the dirt road, his mind whirling with possibilities. He had no idea where it would take him, but at this point, it was the only option. Kevin wasn't about to let Valerie go without doing everything he could to help her. The road was bumpy, uneven, but Kevin pushed forward, his focus narrowed on the sound of the engines in the distance. The sound was faint, but it was still there, a low rumble in the background. It was all the motivation he needed. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert, and Kevin felt the oppressive weight of the desert night creeping in. He couldn't afford to lose sight of the SUVs. The last thing he needed was to get lost in the desert with no way of finding his way back. But he couldn't turn around now. He had to stay ahead of them. He had to figure out what was going on, and he had to do it fast. The terrain grew rougher, and Kevin's legs began to ache, but his determination only grew stronger. There was no way he was going to let Valerie down. Whatever game the men in suits were playing, he was going to figure it out. And if they were involved in anything illegal, he was going to make sure they paid the price. He couldn't let anyone, especially Valerie, become a pawn in their dangerous game. After what felt like hours of running and navigating the treacherous path, Kevin spotted the SUVs again. They had slowed down, but they were still moving forward, following the road ahead. Kevin knew he had to be careful now. He couldn't risk drawing attention to himself. But there was a glimmer of hope. He wasn't far behind. He took cover behind a rock outcropping, crouching low as he watched the SUVs continue on. They were heading toward a cluster of buildings up ahead, small, forgotten structures that seemed to belong to some long-abandoned settlement. The buildings were barely visible from the highway, hidden away in the vast expanse of the desert. It was the perfect place for people who wanted to disappear. Kevin's pulse quickened as he pieced the puzzle together. The men in suits weren't just criminals, they were organized, and they had set up shop somewhere out here in the middle of nowhere. They had likely been using this spot as a hideout, a place where they could operate without interference. And Valerie had unwittingly walked right into their trap. Kevin knew that he couldn't risk waiting for the authorities. If he did, Valerie might be gone before they even got close. The clock was ticking, and every minute he wasted brought her one step closer to danger. The stakes had never been higher, and Kevin knew this was a moment he couldn't afford to screw up. He waited for the SUVs to reach the entrance to the abandoned settlement, then followed at a distance, staying low and careful. His mind was running a mile a minute, calculating his next move, trying to figure out how he was going to get Valerie out of there without getting caught. The buildings loomed ahead, the remnants of a forgotten time. Kevin could hear the sound of the SUVs parking, the engines powering down, and the men stepping out. The air was heavy with the scent of dust and forgotten dreams, and Kevin knew he had to act fast. With his heart pounding in his chest, Kevin slipped around the edge of the settlement, trying to stay out of sight. He couldn't let himself be seen. The stakes were too high, and the men in suits were dangerous. But Valerie was still out there, and as long as she was, Kevin couldn't stop until he brought her back. The abandoned settlement was eerily quiet, but Kevin's instincts were razor-sharp. He was close now, closer than he'd ever been. All he needed was a plan. A way in. And he wasn't going to let anything stop him. Infiltration. The abandoned settlement loomed ahead, bathed in the dying light of the late afternoon. The buildings, long forgotten by time and the world around them, stood like silent sentinels in the vast desert. Each crumbling structure seemed to whisper of lost lives and forgotten promises. The stillness of the place, combined with the setting sun, gave it an eerie, ghost-like quality. But Kevin didn't have time to think about the history of this place. His focus was on one thing, and one thing only, Valerie. He crouched low behind a dilapidated stone wall, peering through the cracks to observe the two SUVs parked in the clearing ahead. The men in suits had disembarked, their cold, calculating presence standing out starkly against the desolate backdrop of the desert. Kevin's eyes darted from one figure to the next, trying to assess the situation. There were 4 men, all of them tall, muscular, and carrying themselves like they were no strangers to danger. But it wasn't just their physical presence that made Kevin nervous, it was the way they moved. They were professionals. Whatever they were involved in, they weren't amateurs. The man with the briefcase, the one who had initially taken charge, was speaking to the others, gesturing toward the buildings with his hand. They seemed to be discussing something serious, their voices low and their movements quick. From where Kevin crouched, he could barely make out the words, but the tone of the conversation made it clear that this wasn't just a routine operation. There was something far bigger at play here. Kevin's heart hammered in his chest. Valerie was somewhere among those men, possibly being held in one of the decrepit buildings. He didn't know what they had planned for her, but whatever it was, it couldn't be good. He had no idea how deep this went or what exactly they were after, but one thing was for sure, he couldn't leave without her. He scanned the perimeter of the settlement. There were no obvious security cameras, no guards posted at the entrance. It seemed almost too easy, but Kevin knew better than to assume anything was simple in a situation like this. The men might not be watching for a threat, because they didn't expect one. But that didn't mean he could waltz in without a plan. He needed to move with precision, with stealth. Kevin took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no turning back now. He had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down. He could see a narrow passageway between 2 crumbling walls on the far side of the settlement. It was a tight fit, but it would lead him closer to the center of the compound, where the men had gathered. He slipped into the shadows, his every step calculated and quiet, as if he were blending into the very desert itself. The sun was now dipping below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows over the sand. The darkness was both a friend and a foe. It would cover him, but it would also make him more vulnerable to the unknown dangers lurking in the night. The first part of the plan was simple: get inside without being seen. Kevin knew that if he could make it into the settlement undetected, he could work his way closer to Valerie. His mind raced through various scenarios, weighing the risks with each step. He reached the narrow passageway and pressed himself against the wall, inching forward like a shadow. The sound of the wind whistling through the broken windows of the surrounding buildings masked his movements, giving him the perfect cover. He crept through the gap, his breath coming in shallow gasps, until he reached a small courtyard at the center of the compound. From here, he could see more clearly. There were two of the men standing guard near the main entrance of a building, their arms crossed, eyes scanning the surroundings. They weren't actively searching for anything, they were just waiting, like sentinels in an ancient temple. Kevin knew that if he could just get closer, he could sneak past them. But he had to be careful. One wrong move, and they would spot him. A small door in the corner of the courtyard caught his eye. It was partially open, and Kevin's heart skipped a beat. This could be his way in. He took a few tentative steps, keeping his body low and his eyes trained on the guards. The men weren't paying attention to the door, they were too focused on the distance, on the shadows outside. Kevin's pulse quickened as he approached the entrance. It was his only chance. He made his move. With one swift motion, he darted across the courtyard, pressing himself against the building's wall as he reached the door. His hand touched the cold metal, and for a second, he hesitated. It was almost too easy. But he couldn't afford to second-guess himself. He pushed the door open slowly, as silently as possible, and slipped inside. The building was dimly lit, with only a few small bulbs flickering above his head. The air inside was thick and stale, filled with the scent of rust and old wood. Kevin's eyes adjusted to the darkness, and he carefully moved through the narrow hallway. Every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet felt like a gunshot, but he kept moving, determined not to make a sound. His mind was focused on one thing, finding Valerie. He moved down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the worn carpet beneath him. There were doors on either side, each one closed and locked, but he didn't stop to check them. He needed to find the room where they were holding her. He had no idea where she was, but something deep in his gut told him that he was getting close. As he moved deeper into the building, he heard voices up ahead, low and urgent. He froze, pressing himself against the wall, listening intently. The voices were coming from a room just beyond the hallway. Kevin didn't recognize the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were talking about Valerie. His heart skipped a beat. They had to be talking about her. He couldn't let them know he was here. Kevin held his breath, waiting until the voices faded away. When the sounds of conversation disappeared, he slowly crept toward the room. He could see through a small crack in the door that two of the men were sitting at a table, their backs to him. He couldn't get caught now. He pushed the door open just a fraction, careful not to let it creak. Inside, he could see a small metal chair in the middle of the room, and his heart sank when he saw Valerie sitting in it, her hands bound behind her back. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with a mixture of relief and fear. "Kevin," she whispered, her voice trembling. "How did you?" "I'm getting you out of here," Kevin interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. He moved quickly, untangling the ropes that bound her wrists, trying not to make any noise. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, but Valerie's wide eyes told him she was starting to believe that he really was here to help. The door creaked behind him. Kevin's heart stopped. Someone was coming. In a panic, he grabbed Valerie's arm and pulled her toward the far corner of the room, hiding behind a stack of crates. The men had stopped talking, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Kevin's ears rang with the sound of his own breathing. He held his breath, praying they wouldn't hear him. Footsteps echoed down the hall. Kevin tensed. He had to move, and fast. He could feel the pressure mounting as the footsteps grew louder, closer. His mind raced, calculating his next move. They couldn't be caught now, not when they were so close. But just as the door began to open, a sudden burst of gunfire rang out from the courtyard. The men in suits rushed to action, running toward the exit with weapons drawn. Kevin didn't waste a second. He grabbed Valerie's hand, pulling her toward the back exit. They had no choice but to run. The escape. Kevin's heart hammered in his chest as the echo of gunfire rang through the building, reverberating off the cracked walls. The chaos outside was a stark contrast to the stillness inside the room, and Kevin's adrenaline surged in response. He had no idea what was happening out there, but it didn't matter, he couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Come on. Kevin hissed to Valerie, his grip tightening around her wrist as he pulled her toward the back exit. His mind raced as he scanned the dimly lit hallway, his eyes catching fleeting glimpses of shadows moving in the distance. He didn't know who had fired that shot, but he didn't care. All he cared about was getting Valerie out of this hellhole alive. They reached the back door, and Kevin swung it open cautiously. The air outside was cool, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat inside the building. They slipped out into the night, the desert stretching out before them in all its desolate vastness. The quiet of the desert night felt unnerving, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The world had suddenly become too quiet. "We've got to move fast," Kevin whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "No time to waste." Valerie nodded, her face pale but determined. The look in her eyes told Kevin that she was just as determined as he was to get out of this alive. She had been through too much already, and the terror in her eyes made Kevin's heart ache. She wasn't a criminal. She was just a woman who had been swept up in something far larger than herself. They moved quickly, keeping low to the ground as they skirted the edge of the compound, careful not to make a sound. Kevin's eyes darted from shadow to shadow, constantly scanning the surroundings. The men were still in the courtyard, but they were too far away to notice them just yet. But the next few minutes were crucial. They had no idea how many more men were inside the settlement or how many were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to make a mistake. They reached the edge of the settlement and paused, taking shelter behind a large stack of abandoned crates. Kevin crouched down, pulling Valerie into the shadowed corner with him. His breathing was ragged, his body trembling with the energy of the chase, but he didn't dare stop. "We can't stay here," Kevin muttered. "We need a plan." Valerie looked at him, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there too. A flicker of hope. She trusted him. After everything they'd been through, she had come to rely on him. And he couldn't let her down. "Where do we go?" Valerie whispered. "They'll be looking for us." Kevin thought quickly. The nearest town was miles away, but he had no choice but to head toward it. He knew the terrain well enough to navigate the desert by night, but it was a dangerous journey. They wouldn't make it very far if they were caught in the open, and the men in the settlement weren't likely to give up that easily. "I know a way," Kevin said, his mind racing. "There's a path through the mountains about a mile east of here. It's hard to see in the dark, but it'll lead us to safety." Valerie nodded, her face set with determination. "Let's go." They started running, their footsteps muffled by the soft sand and the wind howling through the night. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the world was bearing down on them. Kevin kept his pace steady, pushing forward with every ounce of energy he had left. They needed to put as much distance between themselves and the compound as possible before the men figured out they were gone. But as they reached the edge of the settlement, Kevin heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind them. Low voices murmured through the darkness, too distant to be understood, but close enough to send a jolt of panic through Kevin's chest. "They're coming," he whispered urgently. "We need to move faster." Valerie's face was grim, her body moving with the same urgency as Kevin's. They pushed themselves harder, running through the desert night, the faint moonlight casting long shadows ahead of them. The wind whipped around them, but they didn't stop. They couldn't. Every now and then, Kevin glanced over his shoulder, watching as the figures of the men in suits emerged from the darkness, their flashlights sweeping through the desert. They weren't far behind. The men were good at this, good at tracking. And Kevin knew it wouldn't take long for them to catch up if they didn't find cover soon. They reached the base of the mountains just as the sound of the men's pursuit grew louder. The rocky terrain loomed ahead of them, jagged and unforgiving, but it was their only hope. Kevin could hear his own ragged breathing as he pushed forward, feeling his legs begin to burn with exhaustion. The adrenaline was wearing off, and the reality of the situation was sinking in. They couldn't keep running forever. They climbed quickly, moving up the side of the mountain, their hands scraping against the rough stone. The climb was treacherous, but Kevin didn't care. He needed to get them to safety. Halfway up, they paused, panting for breath. Kevin wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind working to stay focused. He knew the mountain trail well, but the climb was steep and unforgiving. They couldn't afford to slip. Every movement had to be calculated. "We're almost there," Kevin said through gritted teeth. "Just a little farther." Valerie nodded, her face flushed from the exertion but determined. She looked at Kevin, her eyes filled with gratitude and trust. She hadn't said much, but Kevin could see it in her eyes. She was with him, no questions asked. She had no choice but to follow him into the unknown. The sound of the men's pursuit was growing louder, and Kevin's pulse quickened. They were close, too close. Kevin pushed forward, not daring to look back, focusing on the rocky path ahead. He could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of their situation bearing down on him. The mountain trail was winding, and Kevin knew that if they didn't find shelter soon, they would be caught. He spotted a small cave just ahead, a narrow opening barely visible in the dark. It was their only chance. "Over here," Kevin whispered urgently, pulling Valerie toward the cave. They ducked inside, the cool air inside the cave a welcome relief from the oppressive heat of the desert. They were safe, at least for now. Kevin crouched down, his back against the wall, as he tried to catch his breath. Valerie sat next to him, her eyes scanning the darkness outside. She was listening for the sound of footsteps, waiting for the men to pass them by. But the cave was quiet, and for the first time in what felt like hours, they could breathe. "We've bought some time," Kevin said, his voice hoarse. "But we can't stay here long. They'll come looking for us. And if they find us, we're done." Valerie nodded, her face pale but resolute. "What do we do now?" Kevin took a deep breath, his mind racing as he tried to piece together their next move. They were far from safe, and the men were relentless. But for the first time, he allowed himself a moment to think. There had to be a way out of this. There had to be. He looked at Valerie, her eyes still wide with fear but filled with hope. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing for sure, he wouldn't leave her behind. They had come this far together. And now, they would finish this together. "We're not giving up," Kevin said, his voice steady with determination. "We'll make it through. Together."